An intricate web of trade spanning 3 continents collapsed in less than a generation. Around 1200 BCE, the routes that carried tin, copper, and luxury goods between Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and the Aegean fell silent. The great palaces and empires that depended on these networks crumbled along with them. By the end of this video, you will understand the perfect storm of events that erased these ancient highways and the new systems that rose to take their place. Climate change, mysterious invaders, and the hidden fragility of complex networks all played a part. The answers reveal not just how the old world ended, but what emerged from its ashes. What would it take for the connections we depend on today to simply disappear? To understand what vanished, we must first see the world that existed before the collapse. The Late Bronze Age was not a collection of isolated kingdoms, each tending their own gardens. It was a tightly woven tapestry of civilizations that stretched from the Nile to the Indus, from the Aegean Islands to the Persian Gulf. On one side stood Egypt, powerful and wealthy, with its pharaohs and temples of stone. To the north lay the Hittite Empire, based in what is now Turkey, a rival that matched Egypt in military strength and ambition. Across the sea, the Mycenaean Greeks controlled a network of fortified palaces and trade outposts, while the Minoans on Crete had already established some of the earliest maritime routes in the Mediterranean. Further east, the Assyrians and Babylonians dominated the plains of Mesopotamia, and beyond them lay the Elamites in modern Iran, who controlled access to the highlands and their resources. And far to the southeast, along the banks of the Indus River, a sophisticated urban civilization thrived with cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, known for their advanced drainage systems and standardized weights. These societies were not just aware of each other, they depended on one another. Egypt needed timber from Lebanon and tin from the distant mountains of what is now Afghanistan to make bronze for weapons and tools. The Hittites required silver and grain. The Mycenaean palaces imported ivory and lapis lazuli from Egypt and Mesopotamia, while exporting their own pottery and olive oil. Indus Valley seals have been found in the ruins of Ur, a major Sumerian city, proof that goods and ideas traveled thousands of miles. It was a system of interdependence unlike anything the world had seen before. One kingdom's surplus became another's necessity. A drought in one region could trigger a shortage of copper in another. The routes that connected them were not just trade lanes. They were lifelines, and they were far more fragile than anyone realized. The routes themselves were engineering marvels of their time. Take the overland road that carried tin from the mountains of central Anatolia down to the Mediterranean coast. This was not a simple trail through the wilderness. It was a carefully managed corridor, with way stations spaced a day's journey apart where merchants could rest, water their animals, and exchange news. The tin itself was the lifeblood of the bronze industry. Without it, copper was too soft to make effective tools or weapons, so entire systems were built to keep that ore moving. Caravans of donkeys and sometimes ox carts trudged through rugged passes, guarded by local chieftains who had been paid in advance for safe passage. Contracts were sealed with clay tablets, written in cuneiform, recording exactly how many loads of tin were expected and what payment would be given. It was a primitive version of an international supply chain, complete with insurance agreements and dispute resolution procedures. Now shift your view to the sea. The Mediterranean was the superhighway of its age, and the ships that sailed it were the 18-wheelers of the Bronze Age. Ports like Ugarit in modern Syria and Byblos in Lebanon became bustling hubs. They were not just loading docks, they were cities of warehouses, temple treasuries, and scribal offices. A Mycenaean Greek ship arriving at Ugarit might carry pottery and olive oil, then load up with cedar timber, glass ingots, and Egyptian linen. The voyage itself required precise knowledge of currents, winds, and seasonal patterns. Sailors learned to hug the coast, hopping from island to island, never straying far from land. The sea lanes were protected by diplomatic treaties. A ship from one kingdom could dock at a foreign port because both rulers had agreed to mutual trade privileges. The Hittite king, for example, might send a letter to the pharaoh guaranteeing the safety of Egyptian merchants traveling through his territory. These agreements were carved into stone tablets and exchanged as tokens of goodwill. Further east, another great maritime route connected Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley. Ships sailed down the Persian Gulf, past the coast of modern Saudi Arabia and Iran, all the way to the mouth of the Indus River. These vessels carried copper, timber, and precious stones from Oman and Bahrain. But the most striking cargo was the Indus trade goods themselves: cotton textiles, carnelian beads, and carved ivory. Archaeologists have found Indus seals in Mesopotamian cities like stamped onto bales of cloth and packets of spices. This was not a casual exchange. It was a regular, organized flow of goods that required shared standards of weight and measurement. Indus weights were remarkably uniform, square blocks of chert that matched a system used across the Gulf region. This allowed merchants to trust that a load of copper weighed the same here as it did there. And then there was the overland route through Iran, a land bridge that connected Mesopotamia to Central Asia. This road climbed through the Zagros Mountains, past the Elamite capital of Susa, and stretched eastward across the Iranian plateau toward the Lapis lazuli mines of Badakhshan in modern Afghanistan. Lapis lazuli was the luxury stone of the ancient world, prized for its deep blue color. It adorned the tombs of pharaohs and the statues of Sumerian gods. Moving it required crossing deserts and high passes, with armed escorts protecting the caravans from raiders. The journey could take months, yet the trade continued for centuries because the demand was constant. Kings wanted blue stone for their jewelry and their ceremonial objects. They were willing to pay the cost. All of these routes shared something important. They did not run on luck or spontaneous adventure. They ran on trust. Kings sent envoys, exchanged gifts, and signed treaties to keep the roads open. Merchants formed long-term relationships with suppliers in distant lands. Port cities grew wealthy from harbor fees and hosted diplomats from other empires. It was a system built on human agreement as much as on geography, and that is exactly why it could be destroyed so quickly. No single artifact speaks louder about the scale of Bronze Age trade than a shipwreck discovered off the southern coast of Turkey in 1982. The Uluburun wreck, as it came to be known, lies in waters 150 feet deep, its cargo scattered across the seafloor. When archaeologists excavated it, they uncovered something remarkable. The ship had been carrying a wealth of goods from at least 7 different cultures. Copper ingots from Cyprus, each shaped like an oxhide weighing about 60 pounds, were stacked in rows. Tin ingots from either Central Asia or the Taurus Mountains, the exact source still debated, were packed alongside them. Together they formed the raw materials for bronze. Mixed in were Canaanite jars filled with resin, used for perfumes and medicines. Elephant and hippopotamus ivory from Africa had been carved into raw blocks. Ostriches had contributed their eggs, transformed into decorative vessels. Glass ingots in deep cobalt blue, among the earliest ever found, likely came from Egypt or Mesopotamia. Spices, including coriander and safflower, had been stored in sealed containers, and there were pieces of jewelry, scrap metal, and a golden scarab bearing the name of Nefertiti, the famous Egyptian queen. The ship itself was small by modern standards, about 50 feet long, but its cargo represented a microcosm of the entire Bronze Age economy. It had likely sailed from a Levantine port, bound for the Aegean, carrying goods from 3 continents. The presence of both copper and tin together is especially telling. Those two metals had to be combined to produce bronze, and they were rarely mined in the same region. So a merchant who could bring them together in one place held the key to the entire technology of the age. The Uluburun Shipwreck proves that such long-distance voyages were not rare exceptions. They were regular, organized, and massive in scale. The cargo alone weighed around 15 tons. Now consider the Amarna letters, a cache of clay tablets discovered in Egypt at the site of Akhenaten, the short-lived capital built by Pharaoh Akhenaten. These are not inventory lists or commercial receipts. They are diplomatic correspondence written in Akkadian, the common language of the era. The letters date to the 14th century BC, a few generations before the collapse began. They reveal the entire machinery of international relations. One letter from the king of Babylon complains that the Egyptian pharaoh has not sent enough gold to seal a marriage alliance. Another from the ruler of Elashia, likely Cyprus, discusses the price of copper and asks for Egyptian assistance. Still another from the Hittite king outlines a trade agreement for shipments of silver and timber. What is striking about these letters is their tone. They speak of trust and obligation, of gifts and countergifts, but beneath the polite language lies a hard economic truth. These kings needed each other. They needed the raw materials that only distant lands could provide. The letters show a system where political alliance and trade were inseparable. If the relationship broke down, the flow of goods could stop, and that would ripple across the entire network. Finally, there is the evidence of the tin itself. Ingots of tin have been found scattered across the Mediterranean, from Israel to Greece to Italy. They all share a similar shape, a flat bar with rounded ends, easy to load onto ships or pack onto donkeys. Chemical analysis of these ingots has revealed that some of the tin likely came from the same distant sources, possibly the mountains of Uzbekistan or the mines of Cornwall in Britain. That discovery alone rewrites our understanding of how far these routes reached. Merchants were moving tin from the edge of the known world to the center of the Bronze Age economy. And they did it for centuries until the day the trade simply stopped. Taken together, this evidence does more than just prove the existence of trade routes. It shows a system of incredible sophistication. These were not casual barter exchanges between villages. They were multinational operations involving state-sponsored shipments, standardized weights, diplomatic protocols, and a shared understanding of value. The people of the Bronze Age had built something we might recognize today, a global supply chain held together by relationships and held afloat by ships like the one that sank at Uluburun. It was a marvel of its time, and it was about to come crashing down. But trade was never just about goods moving across the sea. In the Bronze Age, trade was the engine of political power itself. Palaces and temples did not simply participate in the exchange of copper or tin. They controlled it. They owned the ships, the warehouses, and the scribes who recorded every shipment. They decided which goods crossed their borders and which did not, and they used that control to legitimize their own authority. Consider the Mycenaean palaces of Greece. We know about them not from grand monuments alone, but from clay tablets inscribed with a script called Linear B. These were not literature or history. They were bureaucratic records, inventories, tax receipts, and lists of workers. One set of tablets from the Palace of Pylos in southwestern Greece tells a remarkable story. It records shipments of perfumed olive oil, a luxury product being sent to Egypt and to the coast of Asia Minor. The oil was not a common commodity. It was scented with herbs and flowers, stored in decorated jars that became prestige objects themselves. These vessels, known as stirrup jars because of their distinctive handles, have been found scattered across the eastern Mediterranean, from Cyprus to the Nile Delta. Archaeologists uncovered one such jar in the tomb of a pharaoh at Thebes, thousands of miles from its place of origin, and on that jar, the clay fingerprints and residue analysis tied it directly to a workshop near the palace of Pylos. The palace had sent that jar, filled with its finest oil, to the most powerful ruler in the world. Why would a Mycenaean king do that? The answer lies at the heart of Bronze Age political economy. To rule, you had to display wealth. You needed precious metals, fine textiles, ivory, and exotic stones to give as gifts to your nobles, to decorate your throne room, and to bury with your ancestors. These goods were not just ornaments, they were symbols of your ability to reach across the world, to demand tribute from distant lands, and to secure the favor of the gods. The more exotic the object, the greater the prestige. A dagger inlaid with lapis lazuli from Afghanistan said, "I command faraway mountains." A throne paneled in ebony from Nubia said, "Pharaoh respects me." Trade was the mechanism by which rulers converted their domestic surplus into this necessary symbolic capital. They controlled the production of olive oil, wine, wool, and pottery, then exchanged those goods for the rare items that confirmed their status. The temples played an equally central role. In Mesopotamia, the great temple complexes, like the ziggurats of were not just places of worship, they were economic centers. They owned land, managed herds, and employed thousands of workers. They also funded trade expeditions. A temple might finance a ship to sail to Dilmun, modern Bahrain, to bring back copper from Oman. The return cargo would be dedicated to the god, but in practice it was stored in temple treasuries and used to support the priesthood and the king. The god's favor and the king's power became one and the same. Trade was a sacred duty. The texts from the city of Mari on the Euphrates describe how the temple of the god Dagon received shipments of tin from the east. The metal was not just a resource, it was a blessing. This system meant that trade was never a simple economic choice. It was a matter of survival for the elite. Without access to foreign luxuries, a ruler could not maintain the loyalty of his court. He could not impress visiting ambassadors. He could not display the grandeur that made his subjects believe he was chosen by the heavens. The palaces and temples were the gatekeepers of the entire network. They decided what left their territory and what came in. They demanded taxes in the form of goods that could be traded. They commissioned the ships and hired the crews, and they held the scribes who tracked every transaction. The Linear B tablets from Pylos even record the names of individual shepherds who owed wool to the palace. That wool would be woven into cloth, dyed with imported purple from mollusks, and shipped to Egypt in exchange for gold. The shepherd, tending his flock in a rugged valley, was part of a chain that ended in a pharaoh's treasury. This embedding of trade in the political and religious structure gave the Bronze Age its stability, but it also created a dangerous vulnerability. If the palace fell, if the temple lost its wealth, the entire system of production and distribution could collapse. The trade routes were not separate from the states they served. They were the state's circulatory system, and when those states began to weaken, the routes did not simply slow down. They died. The Mycenaean stirrup jar in a pharaoh's tomb, the Linear B record of oil shipments, the temple ledgers of Mari, all these were signs of a world that had woven commerce into the very fabric of power. It was a beautiful and fragile creation, and it was about to be shattered. The first cracks in this grand system began not with swords or invaders, but with the sky itself. Paleoclimatologists have pieced together a story written in ice cores, cave formations, and ancient lake sediments. Across the eastern Mediterranean, around 1200 BC, the rains began to fail. Year after year, the winter storms that had reliably watered the grain fields and filled the wells grew weaker. The evidence is stark. In the Dead Sea region, sediment layers show a dramatic drop in water levels. In Cyprus and Anatolia, stalagmites from caves record a prolonged period of dryness that lasted for decades. It was not a single bad harvest, but a creeping, relentless drought that squeezed the land. The texts left behind by the Hittites and Egyptians speak of this crisis in desperate tones. Hittite records from the capital Hattusa describe shipments of grain sent to ports along the Anatolian coast to relieve starving populations. But the famines were not limited to one region. Egyptian documents from the reign of Pharaoh Mernep to mention that the king sent grain to the Hittites, their former enemies, to keep them from collapsing entirely. That act of mercy is telling. It shows that the drought was so widespread that even powerful empires could no longer feed their own people. They turned to others for help, and when those others had nothing left to give, the bonds of trust began to fray. As the crops withered, people moved. Entire communities abandoned their villages and sought food in more fertile areas. These were not organized migrations but desperate flows of families and clans moving along the very routes that had once carried tin and copper. They arrived at the gates of palaces and walled cities, asking for shelter or demanding supplies. The local rulers, already struggling to feed their own subjects, could not accommodate them. Tensions rose. The trade routes, once safe corridors for merchants, became paths of conflict. Caravans were raided, ships were attacked. The system of mutual obligation that had held the Bronze Age together began to unravel. This was the moment when a single failure started to trigger others. A shortage of tin meant that bronze weapons could not be repaired or replaced. A broken alliance meant that copper shipments from Cyprus might be cut off. A city that could no longer acquire grain from Egypt had to raid its neighbor instead. The connections that had once been the empire's greatest strength now became channels for collapse. A drought in one place caused a famine in another. A famine in a second place caused an invasion into a third. The network acted like a chain of falling dominoes, each one pulling down the next. And no one saw it coming until it was too late. Destruction arrived not as a single event but as a wave moving from city to city, each fall sending tremors through the network. The Hittite capital of Hattusa, a sprawling fortress of temples and royal archives perched on the Anatolian plateau, was burned and abandoned so quickly that its clay tablets were left scattered on the floors. Scribes had been in the middle of recording shipments and diplomatic letters. They never finished. The palace was never reoccupied. The empire that had rivaled Egypt for centuries simply ceased to exist. At roughly the same time, the great Mycenaean strongholds of Greece, Mycenae itself, Tiryns, Pylos, fell one after another. Excavations reveal thick layers of ash and collapsed stone. The Linear B tablets at Pylos were baked hard by the fire that destroyed the palace, preserving a snapshot of the very last day of administration. Lists of rowers, allocations of bronze, names of shepherds, all frozen in the clay. The people who wrote them did not return to read them. The writing system itself vanished from history for nearly 400 years. On the coast of Syria, the bustling port of Ugarit met a similar fate. This city was the heartbeat of Mediterranean trade, a place where ships from Crete, Cyprus, Egypt, and Anatolia docked to exchange goods and news. Its archives contain a letter from the king of Cyprus, sent just before the end. The letter warns of enemy ships sighted at sea and pleads for the king of Ugarit to send reinforcements, but the response tablet was never dispatched. It was left in the kiln, unfinished. The enemy arrived. Ugarit was sacked and burned, its harbor filled with rubble. The trade route that had passed through its gates was gone forever. Across the eastern Mediterranean, archaeologists have identified dozens of sites with a similar destruction layer dating to the same narrow window, between 1200 and 1170 BC. The pattern is consistent. Major administrative centers were attacked, looted, and left uninhabited for generations. Smaller villages often survived, but the palaces that organized production and long-distance exchange were systematically erased. The economy of scale that allowed bronze to be produced and distributed required central coordination. Without the palatial system, that coordination stopped. The tin from Central Asia, the copper from Cyprus, the gold from Egypt, the lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, all of these had flowed through nodes that now lay in ruins. The entire supply chain shattered. What is most striking is not that one empire fell, but that so many fell together, and in such a compressed span of time. The Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Minoans, the Egyptians weakened and retreated. The city-states of the Levant and Cyprus all suffered catastrophic setbacks. The trade routes that had bound them together were not merely disrupted, they were erased. A network that had taken centuries to build unraveled in less than a single human lifetime. And the silence that followed was deeper than any economic downturn. It was the silence of lost knowledge, forgotten languages, and abandoned harbors that would not see a foreign sail again for generations. The search for what caused such synchronized devastation has led researchers to look beyond human hands and into the natural world. For decades, historians debated whether invaders or internal rebellions brought down the Bronze Age empires. But a growing body of scientific evidence points to a different culprit, one that left no sword marks on the palace walls. The culprit was the weather, but not a single storm or a bad season. It was a drought that lasted not for years but for decades, and it changed everything. Scientists have pieced together this story from unlikely sources. They drilled into the mud at the bottom of lakes and studied the layers of sediment that built up year after year. Each layer contains tiny clues, pollen grains from ancient plants, the shells of microscopic creatures, and the chemical signatures of rainfall. In the Dead Sea, core samples revealed a dramatic drop in water levels around 1200 BCE. The lake shrank and the surrounding landscape dried out. Similar patterns emerged from lakes in Turkey, Cyprus, and Greece. Everywhere the sediment told the same story. The rains that had sustained the region for centuries grew weak and unreliable. But the most precise evidence comes from trees. Tree rings offer a year-by-year record of growing conditions. In wet years, the rings are wide. In dry years, they are narrow. By matching ring patterns from ancient timbers and even from timbers preserved in archaeological sites, researchers built a continuous timeline stretching back more than 3,000 years. That timeline shows a period of intense drought beginning around 1200 BC and lasting for nearly a century. It was not a single dry spell but a megadrought, a prolonged shift in climate that squeezed the land year after year without relief. The impact on agriculture was devastating. Bronze Age farming relied on winter rains to water the wheat and barley that fed entire kingdoms. When the rains failed, the harvests failed. The first year of drought could be managed if granaries held surplus. The second year drained those reserves. By the third and fourth years, there was nothing left. People began to go hungry. The palaces and temples, which depended on taxes collected as grain and livestock, saw their income vanish. They could no longer pay their administrators, support their craftsmen, or fund the trade expeditions that brought in copper and tin. The surplus that had once fueled long-distance exchange simply evaporated. The scribes who recorded shipments of olive oil and wine found themselves recording shortages instead. The palace economies that had controlled production for centuries were built on a narrow margin. They needed consistent rainfall to produce enough food to support the non-farming population, the metalworkers, potters, weavers, scribes, and soldiers. Without that surplus, the entire system faltered. The kings could not feed their courts, much less finance an expedition to Cyprus for copper. The temple treasuries could not fill the storehouses. The trade routes that had carried goods across continents began to empty because there was nothing left to trade. But the drought did not act alone. It created a cascade of consequences that amplified every other stressor. When the harvests failed, hungry populations moved. They left their villages and headed toward the cities, hoping for relief. The cities, already strained, could not absorb them. Tensions flared. Raiders from the countryside attacked the very caravans that used to bring supplies. The once safe routes became dangerous. The palatial authorities, weakened by lack of resources, could not protect the merchants or the roads. Trust eroded. The diplomatic letters between kings, once filled with promises of gold and tin, now carried desperate pleas for grain, and when those pleas went unanswered, alliances broke apart. The drought had not only starved the land, it had starved the relationships that held the Bronze Age world together. This climatic crisis did not happen in isolation. It coincided with the movements of the so-called Sea Peoples, with earthquakes and with internal rebellions, but the drought acted as a multiplier. It made every other problem worse. A kingdom already weakened by famine could not repel an invasion. A city whose granaries were empty could not withstand a siege. A trade network that had lost its surplus could not rebuild after a single attack. The Megadrought did not swing the sword or burn the palace. It drained the life from the system until the system collapsed under its own weight. And when the rains finally returned, decades later, the palaces were gone, the trade routes were silent, and the world had already moved on to something new. But drought was not the only force shaking the Bronze Age world. While the rains failed and the harvests withered, the ground itself began to move beneath the cities. A different kind of disaster was unfolding, one that struck without warning and left its mark in cracked stone and toppled walls. The theory that has gained traction among archaeologists and seismologists in recent decades is known as an earthquake storm. This is not a single tremor. It is a sequence of large earthquakes, each one triggered by the release of stress along a fault line that can unfold over days, weeks, or even years. And the geological evidence suggests that precisely such a storm swept through the eastern Mediterranean around the time the Bronze Age empires fell. The region sits atop a complex web of tectonic plates, the East Anatolian Fault running through what is now Turkey, and the Hellenic Arc, which curves through the Aegean Sea and past Crete, are two of the most active seismic zones on Earth. When one section of a fault ruptures in a major earthquake, it transfers stress to adjacent sections, making them more likely to fail in turn. A single large quake can set off a chain reaction that propagates along hundreds of miles of fault line. That is what researchers believe happened in the decades around 1200 BCE. The evidence is written in the ruins themselves. At the site of ancient Troy, on the northwestern coast of Anatolia, excavators found walls that had been knocked sideways and foundations that had shifted out of alignment. The damage was not consistent with a slow collapse from neglect or a fire. The stones had been violently displaced, as if the ground had lurched beneath them. At Mycenae, the great citadel of the Greek mainland, similar patterns emerged. The massive stone blocks of the Lion Gate, each weighing several tons, had been pushed out of their original positions. The palace walls showed cracks that ran from top to bottom, and sections of the fortifications had slumped outward as if the earth had simply dropped away. At Hattusa, the Hittite capital, the scene was even more dramatic. This was a city of temples and royal archives built on a hillside with terraced stone foundations. The entire upper city was abandoned after a series of seismic events that left the structures uninhabitable. The great stone gateways, carved with figures of gods and lions, were found toppled forward as if pushed from behind. The damage was not random. It followed a pattern consistent with a major earthquake, and the same pattern appears at site after site across the region. What makes the earthquake storm theory so compelling is the timing. The damage at Troy, Mycenae, and Hattusa all dates to roughly the same narrow window. These were not isolated tragedies separated by centuries. They were simultaneous catastrophes that struck the critical nodes of the Bronze Age trade network within a few years of each other. A palace that collapsed could no longer store and redistribute grain. A port whose harbor walls were shattered could no longer receive ships. A road blocked by a landslide could no longer carry caravans. The infrastructure that had taken generations to build was undone in moments, and the impact rippled outward. A city that could no longer trade could not acquire the tin it needed to repair its bronze tools. A kingdom that could not repair its tools could not rebuild its walls. A region that could not rebuild its walls was vulnerable to every other pressure that followed. The earthquakes did not act alone. They acted as a force multiplier, compounding the damage already done by the drought. The harvests had failed, and now the storage facilities themselves lay in rubble. The trade routes had emptied, and now the roads were broken. The palaces that had organized production for centuries were reduced to piles of cracked stone. The people who survived the shaking faced a world where the old systems of support had literally crumbled around them. What could possibly replace a network built over so many centuries when both the land and the buildings themselves had turned against the people who depended on them? Then came the attackers that no one could explain. The Great Wall of the Temple of Medinet Habu, built by Pharaoh Ramesses III in the 12th century BC, tells their story in carved reliefs and hieroglyphic inscriptions. The scenes show a fleet of ships, not the sleek trading vessels that had once docked at Ugarit or Byblos, but something different. The ships are crowded with warriors and their families, women and children visible among the armed men. The hieroglyphs name them collectively as the Sea Peoples, a term that has puzzled historians ever since. The inscription describes them as coming from the islands and the sea, a foreign force that swept down the coasts of the eastern Mediterranean. Ramesses III claimed to have defeated them in a great battle both on land and on water, but the carvings also reveal something else. These were not a single organized army. The Sea Peoples are depicted in different helmets, different shields, different styles of dress. The texts list their constituent groups by name: the Peliset, the Shurden, the Jekka, the Lucca, the Shekelesh, and others. Each group had its own identity, its own origin, and that origin has become a central mystery of the Bronze Age collapse. Researchers have spent more than a century trying to identify these peoples. The Peliset are widely linked to the Philistines, who later settled in the coastal region of Canaan and gave their name to Palestine. The Shurden may have come from Sardinia. The Jekka might be connected to the region of Troy, but none of these identifications are certain. What is clear is that the Sea Peoples were not a single invading force with a unified command. They were a loose coalition of displaced populations, driven from their homelands by the same pressures that were crumbling the empires. Drought, famine, and earthquakes had already destabilized large parts of the Mediterranean. People who could no longer grow food, who had lost their homes to seismic destruction, and who saw their own rulers fail, took to the sea. They became raiders, migrants, refugees, and conquerors all at once. The trade routes that had once connected the world now became highways for these desperate movements. The same ships that had carried tin and copper now carried armed groups looking for plunder or a place to settle. The same ports that had once been hubs of exchange became targets for attack. The Sea Peoples did not have to defeat every city on the coast. They only had to sever a few critical links. When they sacked Ugarit, the entire northern trade route collapsed. When they raided Cyprus, the copper supply to the Aegean was cut. When they struck the Syrian coast, the overland roads to Mesopotamia became impassable. The network that had already been weakened by climate and seismic shocks was finally severed by human action. The Egyptian records at Medinet Habu present Ramesses III as the savior who stood against this tide. But even his victory was not complete. The inscriptions describe how the Sea Peoples were repelled from Egypt's borders, but they also show that some groups were allowed to settle in Egyptian-controlled territory as vassals. The Peliset, for example, were settled in Canaan, where they established their own cities and culture. Egypt survived as a state, but it lost its empire, its trade routes, and its influence. The international system that had defined the Bronze Age was gone, and the Sea Peoples themselves, once they had done their damage, did not disappear so much as dissolve into the regions they had transformed. Some groups assimilated into local populations. Others remained as distinct cultures for centuries. The name Sea Peoples faded from history, but the memory of their arrival lived on in the stories of lost cities and fallen kingdoms. The scholarly debate over their identity continues to this day, but the most important lesson is not who they were. It is what their movement reveals about the fragility of the Bronze Age world. They were not a cause of the collapse so much as a symptom of it. The droughts, earthquakes, and famines had already shattered the old order. The Sea Peoples were the final wave that washed away what remained of the trade routes. And when that wave receded, the world was left empty of the connections that had once defined it. The real weakness was not external attack but internal structure. The Bronze Age trade network had become so specialized, so finely tuned, that it resembled a machine with no redundant parts. Every piece depended on every other piece, and when one component failed, the whole system seized up. This is the central insight of what historians call systemic collapse theory, and it explains more than any single invader or earthquake ever could. Think about the journey of a single ingot of tin. It began its life in the mountains of what is now Afghanistan or Uzbekistan, where miners chiseled the ore from deep veins. From there it was loaded onto pack animals and carried across the Iranian plateau, passing through Elamite territory and the Zagros Mountains until it reached Mesopotamia. In the cities of the Tigris and Euphrates, merchants recorded the shipment on clay tablets and sent it onward to the Mediterranean coast, perhaps to the port of Ugarit. There it was loaded onto a ship bound for Cyprus or Greece, where it would be combined with copper to make bronze. That bronze would then be forged into tools and weapons that sustained entire kingdoms. The chain involved dozens of intermediaries, hundreds of miles of dangerous roads, and the cooperation of at least 5 distinct cultures, and it all depended on every link holding firm. Now consider what happened when the drought struck. The rains failed in Anatolia first, then in Greece, then in the Levant. Harvest shrank. The surplus that had paid for the tin shipments evaporated. The kings could no longer afford to send their agents to distant markets. The local chieftains who guarded the mountain passes stopped receiving their payments and began to demand bribes or simply turned to banditry. The caravans became fewer, then stopped altogether. The tin that had once flowed like a steady river now trickled to nothing, and when the tin stopped, the bronze stopped. Armies could not replace their swords. Farmers could not sharpen their plowshares. The entire technological base of the Bronze Age depended on that single metal. Without it, the system could not function. This fragility is a pattern that appears again and again in complex networks, whether they are electrical grids, supply chains, or ancient empires. When every part is optimized for efficiency, there is no slack, no buffer, no alternative route. The Bronze Age network was a masterpiece of specialization. Cyprus produced almost all the copper. Afghanistan and perhaps Cornwall provided the tin. Egypt supplied gold and grain. Crete and the Levant contributed fine pottery and timber. Each region had its role, and each role was irreplaceable. The system was brittle by design because in stability it was incredibly productive, but stability never lasts. Historians who study network theory point to other examples of this phenomenon: the fall of the Roman Empire, the collapse of the Maya city-states, even the financial crises of modern times. In each case, the same pattern emerges. A system becomes too interconnected and too specialized. When one node fails, the failure propagates outward, amplified rather than absorbed. The Bronze Age collapse was a textbook case. The Hittites lost access to tin and could not arm their soldiers. The Mycenaean palaces could not import the copper they needed to roof their treasuries. The Egyptians saw their eastern trade routes severed and their grain shipments to Anatolia cut off. Each failure made the next one more likely. The system did not just break. It unraveled thread by thread until nothing held. The lesson is that complexity carries a hidden cost. The more efficient a network becomes, the more vulnerable it is to disruption. The Bronze Age kings did not build a system that could bend. They built a system that could break, and break it did. The trade routes that had taken centuries to construct were gone in a single generation. And what replaced them was not a newer, better network. It was something far more humble and far more resilient. But the collapse was not just a story of invaders and empty roads. While earthquakes shook the walls and drought withered the fields, another force was at work, one that came not from the sea or the sky, but from within the cities themselves. The people who had once trusted their kings and priests to provide for them began to lose faith, and when that trust fractured, the internal structure of these ancient states started to crumble alongside their trade routes. The evidence for this silent rebellion survives in the records of the Egyptian workmen at Deir el-Medina, a village of laborers who built and decorated the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. These were not slaves, they were skilled artisans, well-fed and respected, who lived with their families in a walled community. They kept detailed records of their daily lives, written on potsherds and limestone flakes. And among those records is a remarkable event, the first recorded labor strike in history. It happened in the 29th year of the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III, around 1159 BC, right in the middle of the upheaval that was tearing the Bronze Age apart. The workers had not received their rations. No grain, no fish, no oil had been delivered for weeks. They stopped working and marched to the nearby temple of Thutmose III, demanding to be heard. The strike did not last long, but it was a sign of something deeper. The state, which had always managed to feed its people, could no longer keep its promises. The trade routes that brought grain from the Nile Delta to the laborers had been disrupted. The supplies simply stopped flowing. Across the region, similar stories played out in different forms. In the Mycenaean palaces, the Linear B tablets tell of administrators struggling to distribute goods that were growing scarce. The lists of rations become shorter. The number of workers employed by the palace declines. The scribes record debts that were never repaid. The system of redistribution that had sustained the population for centuries was failing. Farmers who could no longer count on the palace to provide protection or seed grain began to withhold their taxes. They hoarded what they had. Local officials, lacking resources from the center, could not enforce the old demands. The state was not invaded from outside, it was hollowed out from within. This loss of faith was not simply about empty stomachs, though hunger certainly played a role. It was about the collapse of a worldview. For generations, the kings and priests had presented themselves as intermediaries with the gods, as the ones who ensured the fertility of the land and the flow of trade. When the droughts came and the harbors fell silent, those claims rang hollow. The people saw that their rulers could not control the rain, could not protect the caravans, could not bring back the copper and tin. The sacred authority of the palace eroded as quickly as its treasury. Local leaders, village elders, and petty chieftains who could at least guarantee the next meal began to gain power at the expense of the old elites. The loyalty that had once been given to distant kings now turned toward those who could offer immediate, tangible help. In some places, this shift happened peacefully. In others, it was marked by violence. Archives from the city of Imar in modern Syria describe how the city council, originally a body of local notables, took over the administration of the temples when the central government could no longer rule. The old order was not overthrown by an army. It was quietly replaced by the people who had been its subjects. The trade routes that had tied these communities to the wider world had vanished, so they no longer needed the kings who had once lorded over them. What emerges from these records is a portrait of a society unraveling not just economically, but emotionally and spiritually. The rituals that had bound communities together, the festivals that marked the cycles of planting and harvest, the offerings made to the gods for safe voyages, all of these depended on a system that no longer functioned. When the trade stopped, the rituals stopped too. The shared understanding of how the world worked, what was valuable, who could be trusted, all of that had to be renegotiated in the midst of crisis. It was not a sudden uprising, but a slow, grinding loss of faith, 1,000 small betrayals by a system that could no longer deliver on its promises. And when the old elites finally fell, they left behind no one to rebuild the trade routes. The roads lay empty not just because the ports were destroyed, but because no one believed in them anymore. The trade routes did not fade away slowly, they vanished. One year, the caravans arrived at the gates of Kultep, the ancient trading colony in central Anatolia, and the Assyrian merchants unloaded their tin and textiles, recorded each transaction on clay tablets, and prepared for the next journey north. The next year, the gates stood empty. The merchants had withdrawn, packing their accounts and leaving the mud-brick houses to collapse into the hillside. Excavations at the site show the telltale signs of an organized departure. The storage jars were emptied, the seals were removed, the people did not die here. They simply left and they never came back. Across the Levantine coast, the same story repeats with different evidence. For centuries, the ports had been littered with fragments of Mycenaean pottery, the distinctive painted vessels that Greek merchants carried wherever they traded. Archaeologists find these shards in layers dating to the 13th century BC, scattered among the warehouses of Ugarit, Byblos, and Tel Abu Hawam. But above that layer, the pottery disappears, not gradually, not replaced by a different style from another region. It simply stops. The ships from the Aegean stopped arriving. The trading partners who had exchanged olive oil and wine for copper and ivory were gone. The potters who had shaped those vessels continued making their own local wares, but the international traffic that had once connected them to the wider world fell silent. The same silence fell over the cities of Mesopotamia. For hundreds of years, the great Sumerian city of Ur had received Indus Valley trade goods, seals made of steatite, carved with elephants and unicorns, stamped with the Indus script, turned up in the homes of merchants and in the temple treasuries. They were proof of a connection that spanned thousands of miles. Then, around the same time that the Mycenaean pottery vanished, the Indus seals disappeared from the Mesopotamian record. No more shipments arrived from the east. The route across the Iranian plateau and down to the Persian Gulf had been cut. The merchants of Ur had no more exotic goods to sell. The entire system of long-distance exchange, built over so many centuries, had ground to a halt. The archaeological record of abandonment is unmistakable. At the Hittite capital of Hattusa, entire archives of clay tablets were left lying on the palace floors, unfired and unread. The scribes had been in the middle of recording the day's shipments when they stopped. The fire that consumed the city baked some of the tablets hard, preserving them for modern scholars, but the work was never finished. At Ugarit, a similar scene played out. The royal palace, a sprawling complex of dozens of rooms, was found with its storerooms still filled with goods. The inhabitants did not have time to pack. They fled or they were overwhelmed. The cuneiform tablets that had documented the trade between Egypt, Cyprus, and the Aegean for generations simply ceased to be written. The last tablet from Ugarit, the one that mentions enemy ships, was left in the kiln half-baked. It was never sent. The cities did not just decline. They emptied. Layers of ash and rubble separate the Bronze Age levels from the Iron Age levels at site after site. At some places, like the Mycenaean palace of Pylos, the destruction was so complete that the site was not reoccupied for centuries. At others, like the port of Ashdod, a small village eventually grew up among the ruins, but without the palaces, the workshops, or the international harbor. The trade routes that had once carried tin from Afghanistan and lapis lazuli from Badakhshan had no reason to exist anymore, because the customers who had demanded those luxuries were no longer there to receive them. The knowledge of how to organize such long-distance exchanges, how to negotiate safe passage through foreign lands, how to maintain diplomatic correspondence with distant kings, all of that faded within a generation or two. The routes themselves became overgrown, forgotten, remembered only in faded legends of wealthy cities that had once stood where now only dust remained. What remained after the silence was a world that had forgotten how to reach across the sea. The Bronze Age empires were gone. The palaces lay in ruin, their storerooms empty, their archives unread. The people who survived did not try to rebuild the old systems. They could not. The knowledge of how to organize a fleet of ships, how to negotiate safe passage through a dozen foreign kingdoms, how to write a contract in Akkadian and seal it with a king's mark, that knowledge had died with the scribes who had kept it. For nearly 3 centuries, from around 1100 BCE to 800 BCE, the Greek mainland and the Aegean islands entered what historians call the Dark Ages. It was not a time of absolute darkness but of profound forgetting. The most dramatic loss was writing. The Mycenaean script known as Linear B had been used exclusively for palace administration, records of wool, grain, livestock, and weapon distributions. When the palaces burned, the need for such records vanished. The scribes had no one to employ them. Within a generation or two, the ability to read and write Linear B disappeared entirely. No one in Greece would use a written language again for hundreds of years until they borrowed an alphabet from the Phoenicians, a people who had emerged from the ruins of the Levantine coast. The clay tablets that had once recorded shipments of olive oil and bronze were left to crumble into dust. Their meanings were lost, population declined sharply. The large settlements that had housed thousands of people shrank to small villages of a few hundred. The great citadels of Mycenae and Turin were abandoned. People moved to less defensible but more fertile locations where they could scratch out a living from the soil. They returned to subsistence farming, wheat, barley, goats, sheep. The intricate division of labor that had supported metalworkers, potters, weavers, and merchants collapsed. Every family had to produce almost everything it needed. The pottery from this period is coarse and undecorated, a far cry from the elegant painted vessels of the Mycenaean age. It was made for function, not for trade. The trade routes that had once carried goods across continents were replaced by nothing more than footpaths between neighboring villages. But long-distance exchange did not vanish entirely. It simply became something else. Instead of organized fleets and royal warehouses, trade turned into low-level, episodic encounters. A ship might land on a remote beach, its crew bartering a few items with local farmers, then sail away. The cargo was no longer measured in tons but in handfuls. The evidence for this survival comes from unexpected places. Amber, the fossilized resin from ancient trees, was highly prized in the Bronze Age for its golden color and supposed magical properties. The main source of amber in Europe was the Baltic coast, thousands of miles from the Aegean. During the height of the Bronze Age, Baltic amber had traveled south along the rivers of Central Europe, passed from hand to hand, until it reached Mycenaean workshops. It was carved into beads and pendants buried in royal tombs. Then the collapse came and the trade stopped, or so it seemed. Yet archaeologists have found Baltic amber beads in Dark Age graves on the Greek mainland, dating to the 10th and 9th centuries BC. The amber had not ceased to flow, it had just changed form. Instead of arriving in bulk shipments, it trickled in small quantities, carried by individual travelers or occasional traders who passed through the region. The network was no longer a highway, it was a winding path used by the brave or the desperate. The amber that reached Greece during the Dark Ages was not a sign of a revived economy. It was a whisper of the old world, a reminder that some connections survived even when the system that had sustained them was gone. Those beads tell us that the collapse was not total. People still moved, goods still changed hands, but the scale, the regularity, the organization had all evaporated. The world had become local again, and it would stay that way for centuries until a new civilization began to piece together the fragments of what had been lost. What took the place of those grand trade routes was something far more modest and, in its own way, far more resilient. Across the lands where palaces had once commanded fleets and armies, a different kind of economy began to take root. It was not a planned replacement. No king decreed it, no merchant designed it. It emerged from the ground up, quite literally, as the people who survived the collapse turned their attention to the most immediate challenge: feeding themselves. The great storehouses of the Bronze Age had been emptied by drought or destroyed by fire. The surpluses that had once supported armies of scribes and metalworkers were gone. So the survivors did what humans have always done when the old systems fail. They returned to the soil. They planted wheat and barley in the valleys, raised goats and sheep on the hillsides, and rebuilt their lives around the rhythm of the seasons rather than the arrival of ships. The evidence for this shift is written in the bones of the land itself. At village sites across Greece and Anatolia, archaeologists find a sudden abundance of grinding stones and storage pits, tools that had been far less common in the palatial era. These were the equipment of a household focused on its own survival. Every family needed to process its own grain, store its own harvest, and manage its own small herd. The division of labor that had sent some people to work as full-time potters and others as full-time weavers collapsed into a simpler arrangement where every household did a little of everything. Pottery from this period tells a clear story of localization. During the Bronze Age, potters had produced fine, wheel-made vessels that were traded across the sea. After the collapse, the same regions produced coarse, hand-built pots with simple shapes and minimal decoration. These were not art objects destined for a foreign king. They were cooking pots and storage jars meant to last a season or two. The clay was sourced from the nearest riverbank, not imported from a distant island. The firing was done in small, open pits, not in the controlled kilns of the palace workshops. Every village made its own, and the style differed from one valley to the next. It was not a sign of decline in skill, though the craftsmanship was simpler. It was a sign of a new priority. The potter no longer needed to impress a buyer in Egypt. He needed to serve the family next door. This shift to local subsistence was not a regression into primitivism. It was a pragmatic adaptation to a world that could no longer support the old complexity. The households that adopted these practices did not lose knowledge. They chose survival over specialization. A farmer who could also weave cloth and repair his own tools was far better equipped to weather a bad harvest than a farmer who depended on a distant blacksmith for every metal implement. The self-sufficient village became the basic unit of life. It was small, usually a few dozen families, surrounded by fields and pastures that it worked collectively. Surplus was stored for emergencies, not shipped to a palace for redistribution. Trade, when it happened, was a local affair, a barter of olives for wool between neighboring communities. The scope of exchange shrank from thousands of miles to a day's walk, and yet this humble economy held within it the seeds of the recovery that would eventually come. Because it was resilient, it allowed populations to stabilize and slowly grow again. Because it was local, it preserved the basic skills of farming, herding, and craft that would later be scaled up. The villages that survived the Dark Ages did so not by clinging to the memory of the Bronze Age, but by letting go of it. They accepted a smaller world. And in doing so, they kept the fundamental human knowledge alive: how to grow food, how to build shelter, how to raise children, how to pass on stories. That foundation, unglamorous and hard-won, would eventually support the rise of new civilizations. The trade routes had fallen silent, but the fields were still green. And the people in those villages, scattered across the hillsides, were already laying the ground for what would come next. A single discovery began to undo the old dependency on distant ore. For centuries, the entire Bronze Age had depended on two metals that were rarely found together. Copper was common enough in Cyprus and a few other places. But tin was scarce, concentrated in a handful of distant sources like the mountains of Afghanistan and perhaps the far reaches of Cornwall. To make bronze, you had to bring these two together across thousands of miles of land and sea. That required the entire fragile network of palaces, treaties, and trade routes. If the network broke, you could not make bronze, and when the network did break, the world stumbled. But then a different metal emerged, one that was not rare, not distant, and not dependent on a single vulnerable supply line. That metal was iron. At first, it was not a superior material. Early iron was softer than bronze and prone to rust. It took more skill and higher temperatures to smelt from its ore. In the Caucasus and Anatolia, blacksmiths slowly learned how to heat iron ore in a furnace, hammer out the impurities, and forge a usable blade or tool. This knowledge was not written down or broadcast to the world. It was passed from master to apprentice, held as a closely guarded secret by certain communities. Yet the secret could not stay hidden forever because the ore itself was everywhere. Iron is one of the most abundant elements on Earth. It is present in almost every soil, in the red rocks of hillsides, in the black sand of riverbeds. A village that had never seen a shipment of tin could dig its own iron ore from a nearby pit. That ore was not free. It required labor to mine, fuel to smelt, and experience to shape. But it was local. It did not require a fleet of ships or a treaty with a distant king. As the knowledge of iron smelting spread from Anatolia into the Levant, then across the Aegean and into Europe, the economic geography of the ancient world began to shift. The old trade routes that had carried copper and tin did not just remain silent because the palaces had fallen. They became unnecessary. A farmer in Greece no longer needed to exchange olive oil for Cypriot copper and Afghan tin just to get a plowshare. He could find iron ore in the hills behind his village, and a local smith could turn it into a tool. The cost of a bronze sword had been tied to the cost of transporting tin across 3,000 miles. An iron sword required only fuel and labor. The price difference was enormous, and price reshaped power. The communities that had once been peripheral to the Bronze Age networks, those that sat on iron ore deposits, suddenly found themselves with a valuable resource that required no import. The Hittite region in Anatolia, where iron smelting had first been refined, became a source of knowledge and technology that slowly disseminated outward. But more importantly, any community that could master the craft became more self-reliant. The old dependency on long-distance trade loosened its grip. The villages of the Dark Ages had already learned to survive without palaces. Now they learned to produce their own metal without foreign supply chains. The transformation was not instant. For generations, bronze remained in use for certain tools and ornaments, but the trajectory was clear. The technology that broke the Bronze Age was not a weapon or an invasion. It was a furnace. The Iron Age did not simply replace one metal with another. It replaced a system of centralized, long-distance control with a decentralized, local capacity. The trade routes that had defined the Old World did not fade because they were forgotten. They faded because the world no longer needed them to make the tools of daily life. And that quiet revolution, smith by smith, village by village, was what finally ended the ancient tyranny of tin. But the sea did not stay empty forever. A new kind of maritime network began to take shape along the same coasts where the old Bronze Age ports had fallen silent. This time, the drivers were not powerful kings or palace scribes, but independent merchants and city dwellers who built their wealth on trade alone. They were the Phoenicians, a people from a narrow strip of land along what is now Lebanon, and they did something the old empires never attempted. They spread their influence not through conquest, not through massive armies, but through a web of trading posts and colonies that stretched the entire length of the Mediterranean. The Phoenician approach was radically different from the palace-controlled systems of the Bronze Age. They did not centralize production in a single capital. Each city operated on its own. Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos competed with one another as often as they cooperated. Instead of a single ruler dictating which goods moved where, dozens of independent ship captains and merchants made their own decisions based on where the best profits could be found. The result was a decentralized network that could bend and adapt to changing circumstances without needing permission from a distant monarch. Their ships were faster and more seaworthy than the old Bronze Age vessels. They ventured beyond the familiar shores of the eastern Mediterranean and into the unknown waters of the central and western basins. They founded settlements that became permanent homes for their traders. On the coast of North Africa, they established Carthage, a city that would one day rival Rome itself. On the southern tip of Iberia, they built Gadir, modern Cadiz, a trading post that gave them access to the abundant silver mines of the region. And further north, they reached into the Atlantic, searching for the tin that the old Bronze Age routes had once brought from distant lands. That tin had become scarce after the collapse. The land routes through Central Europe were slow and unreliable. The Phoenicians solved this problem by going directly to the source. Their ships sailed past the Strait of Gibraltar and up the Atlantic coast of Iberia, where they traded for tin from the mines of Galicia and Cornwall. It was not a simple journey. It required skill, courage, and a willingness to sail beyond the sight of land for days on end. But it worked. The tin flowed again, not through palace scribes and donkey caravans, but through the holds of privately owned ships. The most famous product of the Phoenicians was Tyrian purple, a dye made from the mucus glands of a sea snail called the murex. It took thousands of snails to produce a single gram of dye. The process was labor-intensive and smelled terrible. The result was a color that did not fade in the sun, a deep crimson purple that became a symbol of royalty and wealth for centuries. The Phoenicians controlled this secret tightly. They built their wealth on it, trading the dye for silver, gold, and timber from across the Mediterranean. Unlike the Bronze Age palaces, which had produced goods like perfumed oil under direct state control, the production of Tyrian purple was organized by independent workshops and merchant families. The cities grew rich, but the wealth was spread among many traders, not hoarded in a single treasury. This decentralized system had a crucial advantage. It was resilient. When one city suffered a setback, the others continued to operate. When a trade route was blocked by war or piracy, merchants found another way. There was no single point of failure, no palace whose destruction could bring the whole network down. The Phoenicians did not need to conquer. They needed only to trade, to negotiate, and to build relationships with local peoples wherever they landed. The old Bronze Age trade had been a rigid machine, vulnerable to any broken gear. The Phoenician network was more like a living organism, constantly shifting and adapting. The sea routes they opened did not simply replace what had been lost. They created something new. They connected the Mediterranean from one end to the other in a way that had never been done before. The colonies they founded would grow into cities that shaped the classical world. The merchant families of Tyre and Sidon became legends, and the knowledge they passed on of navigation, of shipbuilding, of how to organize a long-distance trade without a palace became the foundation for the next great chapter of Mediterranean civilization. The old routes had been built on power and trust. The new ones were built on profit and resilience, and that change would echo for the next 2,000 years. While Phoenician ships pushed westward, a different wave of voyagers began to reshape the sea from the other side. Between 800 and 600 BC, Greek city-states sent out thousands of their own people to establish new homes far beyond the Aegean homeland. These were not random migrations born of desperation. They were organized, deliberate acts of colonization that would create an entirely new network of trade routes, one that finally filled the vacuum left by the Bronze Age collapse. The reasons for this mass movement were rooted in the same pressures that had haunted the Old World. The steep, rocky hills of mainland Greece could only support so many people. When the population began to recover and grow during the early Iron Age, the land became scarce. A farmer with 3 sons could not divide his small plot into 4 viable pieces. One of those sons had to leave or the family starved. Rather than fight over shrinking resources at home, the Greek city-states looked to the sea. They sent out expeditions, often led by a single charismatic figure, to find new land where colonies could be planted. Each colony was an independent city, not a direct possession of the mother city. It had its own government, its own walls, and its own destiny, but it kept strong cultural and economic ties to the founding city. The result was a web of Greek-speaking communities strung across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, each one a node in a new trading circuit. The first wave swept north into the Black Sea, a vast inland body of water that the Bronze Age empires had barely touched. Greek settlers founded cities like Sinope and Trapezus on the northern coast of Anatolia, then pushed further to the Crimea and the mouth of the Dnieper River. Here they found something the Greek homeland desperately needed: fertile soil. The plains of modern Ukraine were covered in deep, black earth that produced wheat and barley in staggering abundance. The Bronze Age had relied on the Nile Delta and the river valleys of Mesopotamia for its grain. Now the Black Sea region became the new breadbasket. Ships loaded with cereals sailed south through the Bosporus, past the ruins of Troy and into the Aegean. They brought food to the growing cities of the Greek mainland, and in return they carried olive oil, wine, and finely crafted pottery back north. The trade routes had shifted. The old corridors of the Bronze Age, which had run from Egypt to the Levant and across the Anatolian plateau, were replaced by a new axis running from the Black Sea to the Aegean and further west. The second great wave of colonization turned south and west into Sicily and the southern coast of Italy. This region became known as Magna Graecia, or Greater Greece, and it was a treasure house of natural resources. The soils of Sicily were rich in grain as well. Its hills were covered with oak forests that provided timber for ships and charcoal for smelting, and beneath the earth lay deposits of copper, silver, and iron that the local peoples had exploited for centuries. The Greek colonists did not simply take these resources. They developed them on a scale the island had never seen. They built cities like Syracuse, Acrogas, and Selinus, each one a bustling port surrounded by farmland and mining operations. They used the labor of local populations, some of whom were integrated into the colony, others who were captured and traded as unfree workers. The metal from Sicily's mountains, especially the copper and iron, flowed back to the Greek mainland where it fed the workshops of blacksmiths and armorers. The grain from its fields filled the granaries of Athens and Corinth, and the timber from its forests built the ships that would carry Greek trade across the entire Mediterranean. These colonies were not isolated outposts. They were strategic waypoints that connected the Greek world to regions the Bronze Age had never fully reached. From the Black Sea colonies, Greek merchants traded with the Scythian tribes of the steppes, exchanging wine and textiles for furs, honey, and slaves. From the Sicilian colonies, they traded with the Phoenician settlements on the western coast of the island, and with the native peoples of Italy and Sardinia. The old Bronze Age network had been a point-to-point system, a few major ports connected by a handful of heavily guarded routes. The new Greek network was a mesh, dozens of cities linked by hundreds of possible paths. A ship captain could choose his destination based on the season, the winds, and the price of grain. He was not bound to a single palace or a single route. The goods moving along these new routes were strikingly similar to those of the Bronze Age: metals, grain, timber, textiles, and luxury items. but the organization was fundamentally different. The colonies were not controlled by a central authority. They did not send their surplus to a distant king who redistributed it. They traded as independent entities, negotiating prices, forming alliances, and competing with one another. This competition drove innovation. Cities that could build better harbors attract more ships. Those that could secure reliable grain supplies grew faster. Syracuse, for example, became one of the wealthiest cities in the Greek world because it sat at the crossroads of the eastern and western Mediterranean, controlling the narrow passage between Sicily and the Italian mainland. Its prosperity was not granted by a palace. It was earned through location, leadership, and trade. The Greek colonization wave did more than replace the Bronze Age trade routes. It expanded them, diversified them, and made them more resilient. The old network had been a single strand of thread stretched across the ocean, easily snapped. The new network was a woven fabric full of overlapping connections. If one colony fell into decline, others continued to trade. If a war blocked the passage through the Aegean, ships could reroute around the southern coast of Crete or through the Ionian Sea. The system had learned the lesson of the Bronze Age collapse not by design, but by the inevitable logic of decentralization. And as these new routes pulsed with life, they carried not just goods but ideas, language, and culture. The Greek colonies became outposts of a shared civilization, one that would eventually shape the entire Mediterranean world. The old routes had carried tin and copper. These new routes carried something more enduring, the seeds of a new age. Far from the harbors and the sea lanes, another force was stitching the world back together from the land. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, rising from the plains of northern Mesopotamia, took a completely different approach to rebuilding long-distance exchange. While the Phoenicians and Greeks relied on independent merchants and scattered colonies, the Assyrians built their network through military power and centralized control. Their kings did not ask permission from local chieftains to open a road. They carved the road through enemy territory and stationed soldiers along it to keep it open. The result was a system that connected the Mediterranean coast to the Persian Gulf, not through fragile treaties between equals, but through the organized authority of a single imperial state. The Assyrian innovation that made this possible was the royal road system. These were not simple dirt tracks worn by years of donkey traffic. They were engineered highways surveyed and maintained by the state. The most famous of these, the royal road later used by the Persian Empire, had its roots in these earlier Assyrian networks. Along these roads, the Assyrians built relay stations at regular intervals, roughly a day's journey apart. Each station was a small fortification, stocked with food, water, and fresh horses. A messenger carrying a royal decree could travel from the capital at Nineveh to the Mediterranean coast in a matter of days, a journey that would have taken weeks during the Bronze Age. These roads were not just for messengers, however. They were the arteries of commerce. Merchants who wanted to move goods through Assyrian territory had to pay for the privilege. The empire taxed every shipment that passed along its roads. In return, it guaranteed safety. Bandits who attacked a caravan on an Assyrian road did not face local justice. They faced the full force of the imperial army. This was a revolutionary concept. In the Bronze Age, safe passage depended on the goodwill of local rulers, a fragile agreement that could be broken at any moment. The Assyrians made safe passage a matter of state policy. They enforced it with the same systematic approach they applied to everything else. A merchant traveling from the Mediterranean port of Tyre to the Assyrian heartland would pass through a series of controlled checkpoints. At each one, officials inspected his cargo, collected the appropriate tax, and issued a receipt. The entire journey was documented. The empire knew what was moving, who was moving it, and where it was going. This level of oversight was impossible in the Bronze Age, when information traveled at the speed of a donkey, and no single authority controlled more than a fraction of any trade route. To manage this vast network, the Assyrians developed an administrative system that was more sophisticated than anything the early empires had seen. They used a standardized system of weights and measures across the entire territory, so a merchant in Damascus knew exactly how much a load of grain weighed in Nineveh. They employed scribes who could write in Aramaic, the common language of trade, as well as Akkadian, the language of the court. They even issued documents that functioned like passports, official permissions that granted a merchant safe passage through specific regions and exempted them from certain local tolls. These were not the clay tablets of the Bronze Age with their careful diplomatic language between kings. They were imperial decrees backed by the reach of a standing army. The contrast with the old system could not be starker. The Bronze Age network was a web of alliances, each thread held by mutual agreement between equals. The Assyrian network was a spoke and hub arrangement, with everything flowing toward the capital and radiating back out again. All roads led to Nineveh. All taxes flowed to the imperial treasury. All merchants knew that their safety depended on the continued power of the Assyrian king. This centralized model had advantages that the fragmented Bronze Age system could never match. When a dispute arose between two traders, there was a single authority to appeal to. When a region suffered a bad harvest, the empire could redirect grain from a surplus area through its own roads and depots. When a new source of metal or timber was discovered, the state could organize an expedition to exploit it without negotiating with a dozen local rulers along the way. The efficiency was immense. The Assyrian network moved goods on a scale that rivaled the best years of the Bronze Age. Copper from Cyprus, timber from Lebanon, silver from the Taurus Mountains, all of it flowed through Assyrian channels. The empire had rebuilt what the collapse had destroyed, but it had rebuilt it in its own image, hierarchical, controlled, and answerable to a single throne. Where the Bronze Age had relied on trust, the Assyrians relied on power, and for a time it worked better than anything that had come before. But while the Assyrian roads carried iron and timber, another network was being woven across a landscape of sand and stone. Far south of the Mediterranean, along the scorched edges of the Arabian Peninsula, a different kind of luxury was beginning to move. This was not the copper and tin that had driven the Bronze Age. It was something far more precious, weight for weight, and far more mysterious. It was the resin of two rare trees, frankincense and myrrh. These were not ordinary goods. They were the perfume of the gods, the incense that rose from altars in temples from Babylon to Rome, the balm used to anoint kings and preserve the bodies of the dead. And their source was a narrow strip of land in what is now Oman and Yemen, where the climate and soil produced the finest quality. The demand for these resins had existed even during the Bronze Age, but the volume had been limited by the same constraints that affected all long-distance trade. After the collapse, when the old networks of tin and copper fell silent, the appetite for luxury did not disappear. It found a new channel. The route that carried frankincense and myrrh northward became one of the most enduring trade corridors of the ancient world. It began in the groves of southern Arabia, where the bark of the boswellia tree was cut in the dry season to let the milky sap ooze out and harden into golden tears. Those tears were collected by hand, packed into baskets, and carried on the backs of camels. The camel was the key to this network. Unlike the donkeys and oxen of the Bronze Age, camels could travel for days without water, crossing the vast deserts that separated Arabia from the settled lands of the Levant and Mesopotamia. This was not a route for a quick voyage. The journey from the incense groves to the Mediterranean ports took months. Caravans of hundreds of camels, guarded by armed escorts, wound their way through mountain passes and across gravel plains. They followed a chain of oases where water could be drawn and rest taken. At each stop, local tribes demanded tolls for safe passage. The system was fragile, dependent on agreements that could break down. But the profits were so enormous that the trade kept flowing. Frankincense and myrrh were worth their weight in silver, sometimes more. A single shipment could make a merchant wealthy beyond the dreams of a farmer. The kingdoms that controlled the incense routes rose to power on the back of this trade. The most famous was Saba, the biblical Sheba, a realm that emerged in the highlands of Yemen around 1000 BC. Its kings grew rich not from conquest but from controlling the flow of resin from the groves to the coast. They built cities with massive stone walls and irrigation systems that turned barren hills into terraced fields. They taxed every caravan that passed through their territory, and they used that wealth to project power far beyond their borders. Sabaean inscriptions record diplomatic missions to the courts of Assyria and Mesopotamia. Their kings sent gifts of frankincense and myrrh to foreign rulers, a way of cementing alliances and demonstrating their own prestige. The incense trade did not simply fill a gap left by the Bronze Age collapse. It created a new kind of economy, one based on a single, highly valuable commodity that could not be easily replicated. Unlike tin, which could be sourced from multiple locations, the finest frankincense came only from a narrow band of territory in southern Arabia. That gave the Sabaeans and their neighbors a monopoly that lasted for centuries. The routes they controlled did not replace the old Mediterranean networks entirely. They supplemented them. The luxury goods that had once come from Egypt and the Aegean, ivory, gold, fine textiles, were now joined by the aromatic resins of Arabia. The ports of Gaza and Petra became bustling hubs where incense was unloaded and sent onward to temples and palaces across the Mediterranean world. The demand for these fragrances was so great that it reshaped the political geography of the entire region. Kingdoms rose and fell based on their access to the incense trail. The Nabateans, who later built the rock-cut city of Petra, owed their wealth to controlling the northern end of this route. They became masters of the desert, guiding caravans through the wilderness and charging for the privilege. The incense trade outlasted the Assyrian Empire, the Persian Empire, and even the arrival of Rome. It only faded when the rise of Christianity and later Islam changed the religious use of incense, and when sea routes allowed ships to bypass the overland caravans. But for nearly 1,000 years, the smell of frankincense drifting from the altars of the ancient world was the scent of a network that had risen from the ashes of the Bronze Age. It was a reminder that when one set of routes collapsed, others would always appear to carry the desires of the human heart. On the other side of Asia, a different kind of network was beginning to stir. While the Mediterranean slowly rebuilt its connections through Phoenician ships and Greek colonies, the vast landmass between China and the heart of the continent was waking to a quiet revolution of its own. It would take centuries for these threads to weave together into what later generations would call the Silk Road. But the earliest strands, fragile as spider silk, were already being spun in the early centuries of the first millennium BC. The Bronze Age collapse had severed the western routes that once linked Mesopotamia to the Indus and the Iranian plateau, but it had not touched the eastern half of the continent in the same way. China, still in the midst of its own Bronze Age under the Zhou dynasty, was largely insulated from the catastrophes that had shattered the Mediterranean world. Its trade networks faced in different directions, not yet connected to the lands of the Levant or the Aegean. Yet even here, the old patterns of isolation were beginning to shift. The key players in this story were not the grand empires of the East, but the nomadic peoples of the Central Asian steppes, the vast grasslands that stretched from the Black Sea to the borders of modern China. These were societies that moved with their herds, following the seasons and the grass. They did not build stone cities or leave behind clay tablets filled with trade records. But they were the first to connect the distant ends of the continent. Their mobility was their greatest asset. A horse could cover in days what took a caravan weeks. And the steppe peoples, masters of the horse, could carry news, ideas, and goods across distances that left settled farmers in awe. From their perspective, the lands of China to the east and the lands of Central Asia to the west were not separate worlds. They were the two ends of a highway that passed through their own grazing grounds. The first goods to travel this highway were not the silks and spices that would later define the Silk Road. They were more humble, more practical, and in many ways more revealing. Jade, a hard green stone prized in Chinese culture for its beauty and symbolic purity, began to appear in the graves of elites far beyond the borders of the Zhou kingdom. Archaeologists have found jade ornaments in the burial mounds of the steppe nomads, in the high mountain passes of the Tian Shan range, and even as far west as the shores of the Caspian Sea. This jade had been quarried in the mountains of what is now Xinjiang, a region that would later become the crossroads of the ancient world. It was traded from hand to hand, passed along routes that no single ruler controlled. The exchange was not organized by palaces or recorded in ledgers. It happened at seasonal gatherings where nomadic tribes met to trade, to negotiate marriages, and to settle disputes. There, a herder from the eastern steppes might exchange a piece of jade for a horse from a western clan. The horse itself was perhaps the most transformative commodity of this early network. The steppe peoples bred horses that were smaller and hardier than the chariot horses of the Bronze Age. They had learned to ride them, a skill that gave them an enormous advantage in mobility and warfare. Chinese states, which had long relied on chariots pulled by teams of horses, began to recognize the value of these steppe ponies for cavalry and for long-distance communication. They traded silk, bronze vessels, and grain for the horses that could strengthen their armies. The trade was not always peaceful. There were raids and counter-raids, periods of warfare that interrupted the flow of goods. But the underlying connection persisted. Each generation of nomads and settled farmers knew that the other existed, and that exchange was possible, even when politics made it difficult. Silk, that most famous of all ancient trade goods, made its first tentative appearance in these early exchanges. Chinese silk was already being produced during the Shang and Zhou dynasties, woven from the threads of silkworms that were raised on mulberry leaves in the warm river valleys of eastern China. It was a labor-intensive product, soft, lightweight, and lustrous. In China, it was a mark of status worn by nobles and used as a form of currency for paying taxes and rewarding officials. But it also had a quality that made it ideal for long-distance trade. A bolt of silk was incredibly valuable for its weight. A merchant could carry enough silk in a single pack to buy a dozen horses or a year's supply of grain. That made silk the perfect commodity for crossing the vast, empty spaces of Central Asia, where water was scarce and every ounce of cargo had to earn its keep. By around 800 BCE, fragments of Chinese silk have been found in the tombs of Central Asian elites, buried alongside weapons and ornaments. The silk had not traveled directly from China to those distant graves. It had passed through many hands, each trader adding a small profit, each exchange moving the fabric a little further west. The people who carried it were not Chinese. They were intermediaries, members of tribes and small kingdoms that dotted the oases and mountain valleys of the region. They did not think of themselves as part of a grand trade route connecting east and west. They were simply moving goods that their neighbors wanted, step by step, generation by generation. One of the most remarkable windows into this early exchange was discovered in the Taklamakan Desert, a vast sea of sand in western China that was far more hospitable in ancient times than it is today. In the 1930s, a Swedish explorer named Folke Bergman uncovered a cemetery at a place called Zairo, buried beneath the dunes. The bodies were mummified naturally by the dry heat of the desert, their skin and hair preserved for nearly 4,000 years. Among the grave goods, archaeologists found strands of silk woven into the clothing of the deceased. The silk dated to around 1000 BCE, a time when the Zhou dynasty was still consolidating its power in eastern China. Here, in the depths of the Taklamakan, 4,000 miles from the nearest Chinese capital, someone had been buried in silk. The find was stunning. It proved that the connections we associate with the Silk Road were already active, though on a smaller scale, centuries before the route ever received its name. The people of the Xiao cemetery were not Chinese. They were part of a distinct culture that lived in the oasis cities along the edges of the desert. They farmed wheat and barley, herded cattle and sheep, and buried their dead with elaborate care, and they had access to goods from both east and west. Alongside the silk, excavators found woolen textiles woven with patterns that resembled designs from the Iranian plateau. They found small beads of carnelian, a stone that was probably traded from the Indus Valley. They found fragments of bronze, the metal that had once been the backbone of the old trade routes. The Xiao cemetery is a snapshot of a world that was already connected, long before history began to write its story. These early precursors to the Silk Road were not built by emperors or planned by merchants. They emerged organically, as humans have always moved goods across the landscape. A nomadic chieftain wanted a piece of jade to wear as a symbol of his status. A Chinese lord wanted a fast horse to pull his chariot. A merchant in an oasis town wanted silk to sell to a traveler from the west. Each desire created a channel, small at first, but widening with every generation. The routes that would later carry caravans of 1,000 camels began with a single trader crossing a mountain pass, carrying a bolt of silk in his saddlebag. They began here, in the silent deserts and windswept steppes, where the first threads of a new network were being spun, long before the old ones had even finished crumbling into dust. The Baltic amber that once adorned Mycenaean graves did not vanish from history. It simply slipped into quieter hands. Throughout the Dark Ages and the early Iron Age, traders continued to carry the fossilized resin from the northern coasts of Europe down into the Mediterranean, but the volume shrank drastically, and the route became a fragile thread rather than a broad highway. Excavations on the island of Samos, in a sanctuary of Hera dating to the 8th century BC, have yielded amber beads that match the chemical signature of Baltic sources. They were not part of a palace's inventory or a diplomatic gift. They were offerings, small personal items left by sailors or merchants who had traveled far and wanted to thank the goddess for a safe journey. The amber had made its way south not through organized caravans, but through a chain of independent exchanges, each link spanning a few hundred miles. A trader on the Vistula River bartered amber for iron tools with a traveler from the Carpathian region. That traveler passed the amber to a Greek merchant at a trading post on the Black Sea. The Greek merchant carried it across the Aegean and laid it at the feet of Hera. The old network was gone, but the desire for amber had not died. It had become a quiet current flowing beneath the surface of larger events. Far to the east, the story of lapis lazuli took a different turn. This deep blue stone had been the supreme luxury of the Bronze Age, prized by pharaohs and Mesopotamian kings above almost any other material. Its only known source in the ancient world was the remote mines of Badakhshan, in what is now northeastern Afghanistan, a place so high and rugged that even today reaching it requires days of travel on foot. For centuries, lapis had traveled westward along the same routes that carried tin, passing through the Iranian plateau across Mesopotamia and down to the Mediterranean ports. But when the Bronze Age system collapsed, that pipeline shattered. The demand for lapis did not disappear, but the supply became irregular and expensive. By the early 1st millennium BC, the Assyrian kings who decorated their palaces with lapis reliefs had to obtain the stone through tribute or plunder rather than steady trade. The new power centers of the Iron Age, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Neo-Assyrians, did not abandon lapis entirely, but they increasingly turned to substitutes. Glassmakers in Egypt and the Levant learned to produce a deep blue frit, a synthetic material colored with copper and cobalt that could imitate lapis at a fraction of the cost. The Lapis mines of Afghanistan still produced, but the stone no longer held its old monopoly on prestige. The trade route that had carried it for 1,000 years narrowed to a trickle, surviving only through the patronage of a few wealthy courts that could still afford the genuine article. On the other side of the continent, the Indian Ocean network began to stir back to life, though in a form that would have been barely recognizable to the merchants of Ur. The direct maritime link between Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, so active in the 3rd millennium BC, had been severed during the Bronze Age collapse and remained dormant for centuries. The cities of the Indus had themselves declined, their populations dispersing into smaller agricultural settlements. The great ports of Lothal and Dolivera were abandoned, their docks choked with silt. For nearly 500 years, the waters of the Arabian Sea carried far fewer ships than they had in the age of Harappan seals. But around the 9th century BC, a slow revival began. It was not driven by a single empire or a single commodity. It was driven by the same forces that had sparked the Greek colonization and the Phoenician expansion, the hunger for metal. The kingdom of Saba, growing wealthy on the incense trade, needed copper and tin to equip its armies and to mint the coins that were beginning to replace barter. The source of copper nearest to Arabia was Oman, on the southeastern corner of the peninsula. During the Bronze Age, Omani copper had flowed to Mesopotamia through regular shipments. After the collapse, that traffic had ceased. Now, with the rise of the Sabaean kingdom and the stabilization of the incense routes, the demand for metal returned. Omani copper was reintegrated into the trade network, but the routes had shifted. Instead of sailing directly to Ur, the copper now traveled westward along the coast, stopping at the ports of Aden and Qana, and then being carried overland to the incense groves and onward to the Mediterranean. The old links to the Indus Valley remained broken. No Harappan seals have been found in Iron Age layers at Mesopotamian sites. The Indian subcontinent had become a distant memory, a land of legend rather than a trading partner. And yet the sea did not remain empty forever. The most dramatic evidence of this slow maritime revival comes from a shipwreck discovered off the coast of Israel, near the ancient port of Dor. Dated to the middle of the 8th century BC, about 1,300 years after the Uluburun Shipwreck, this vessel carried a cargo dominated by a single commodity, copper. The ingots were shaped like flat, rectangular plates, a design that was completely different from the oxhide ingots of the Bronze Age. Analysis of the metal traced it to the mines of Cyprus, the same island that had supplied so much of the Mediterranean's copper before the collapse. But the way the copper was shipped had changed. The Bronze Age ingots had been stacked in tight rows, each one weighing around 60 pounds, perfect for palace accountants to count and record. The Dor ingots were smaller, more irregular, and they were packed alongside amphorae filled with wine, olive oil, and fish sauce. This was not a shipment organized by a palace scribe. It was a mixed cargo, assembled by a merchant who bought and sold whatever he could find. The ship itself was likely a private venture, not a royal fleet. The trade had returned to Cyprus, but it had returned on different terms dictated by individual profit rather than state command. The copper flowed again, but it flowed through channels that were decentralized, flexible, and resilient. These surviving threads, the amber, the lapis, the copper, the incense, they did not reweave the old tapestry. They created something new, a patchwork of connections that existed alongside the rising Greek and Phoenician networks. The Indian Ocean would not fully revive until the Hellenistic and Roman periods, when mariners learned to harness the monsoon winds with greater precision. But the fact that it revived at all tells us something essential about human nature. Trade is not a luxury that can be abandoned when times are hard. It is a fundamental drive, a way of reaching beyond the horizon to secure what we need and desire. The Bronze Age collapse had silenced the grand orchestras of commerce, but the solo performances continued in a dozen different keys across a dozen different seas. Each bead of amber, each slab of copper, each fleck of lapis was a note in a melody that never truly stopped playing. It just changed its tune. The collapse of the Bronze Age carries a warning that time has not dulled. The system that fell was not weak in any obvious sense. It was sophisticated, interconnected, and capable of moving goods across thousands of miles with remarkable efficiency. Yet that very sophistication became its undoing. The trade routes had no backup plans. There was no alternative source of tin when the primary supply lines were disrupted. There was no secondary network of ports when the major harbors were sacked. There was no redundancy in the system at all. Every node was essential, and every link was stretched to its limit. This is the first and most uncomfortable lesson the Bronze Age collapse teaches us. Efficiency and resilience are not the same thing. A network built for maximum throughput with minimum waste is a network built to break. The palaces had optimized their supply chains to deliver copper from Cyprus and tin from Central Asia with clockwork precision. They had cut out the middlemen, standardized the weights, and streamlined the bureaucracy. But they had also removed the slack, the extra capacity that could absorb a shock. When the drought came and the harvests failed, there was no surplus stored in reserve because the surplus had already been spent on the next shipment of luxury goods. When the earthquakes cracked the city walls, there was no nearby source of timber to rebuild because the timber had all been imported from a single forest on a single coast. The system was a razor's edge, and the edge broke. The lack of redundancy was not an oversight, it was a choice. The Bronze Age kings had prioritized short-term gain over long-term stability. They had calculated that the cost of maintaining extra stockpiles, alternative routes, and diverse suppliers was too high. That calculation made perfect sense as long as everything went according to plan. But when the plan failed, the cost of being wrong was catastrophic. The entire civilization paid the price for a decision that had seemed prudent at the time. This pattern repeats across the centuries. Overdependence on a single resource, a single route, or a single supplier creates a vulnerability that no amount of efficiency can offset. The second lesson is about the fragility of scale. The Bronze Age trade network was built on the assumption that demand would remain constant. The palaces needed a steady flow of tin to equip their armies, a steady flow of copper to roof their treasuries, and a steady flow of grain to feed their workers. When any one of those flows was interrupted, the others could not compensate. There was no way to substitute iron for bronze, because iron smelting was still a closely guarded secret in a few regions. There was no way to replace imported grain with local crops, because the local soil had been exhausted by centuries of intensive farming. The system had grown too large and too specialized to adapt. It had painted itself into a corner of its own making. The third lesson is the most troubling of all. The Bronze Age collapse demonstrates that climate shocks can destabilize even the most powerful human institutions. The megadrought that struck the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC was not an act of war. It was not a political miscalculation. It was a natural phenomenon that the people of the time could neither predict nor control. They had no meteorological records, no forecasting technology, no way to see the dry years coming, and when the dry years arrived, they had no institutional framework to respond. The palaces tried to redistribute grain from surplus regions to deficit regions, but the drought was so widespread that there was no surplus anywhere. The Hittite king wrote desperate letters to the Egyptian pharaoh begging for food, and the Egyptian pharaoh sent what he could, but it was not enough. The climate had changed faster than the political system could adapt. The relevance of these lessons to our own time is not difficult to see, though it must be approached with care. Modern supply chains stretch across the same oceans and continents that the Bronze Age merchants once crossed. They are even more efficient, even more finely tuned, and in some ways even more fragile. A drought in one region can still raise prices in another. A disruption at a single port can still delay shipments around the world. The materials that power our own technological civilization come from a handful of concentrated sources, just as tin and copper once came from a few distant mines. The questions that the Bronze Age collapse raises are uncomfortable but necessary. What happens when the next megadrought strikes a region that supplies a critical resource? What happens when a seismic event damages the infrastructure that connects global markets? What happens when the system is too optimized to bend? The Bronze Age kings could not see their own vulnerability until it was too late. We have the advantage of their example. The question is whether we will use it or ignore it. The past offers no guarantees, only patterns, and the pattern of the Bronze Age collapse is written in ruins that still speak across 3,000 years. And yet, for all we have learned, the deepest mysteries remain unsolved. The Sea Peoples left behind no written records of their own, no temples, no annals, no names of kings. Everything we know about them comes from the enemies they fought, the cities they burned, and the scattered traces they left in the layers of ash. This absence of direct evidence transforms them from a historical people into a puzzle that historians and archaeologists are still trying to assemble without a box lid to guide them. The questions pile up like broken pottery shards. Were they a single coalition or a loose collection of unrelated migrations? Did they originate from the Aegean Islands, the Anatolian coast, or somewhere else entirely? The clay tablets of Ugarit mention enemy ships but never describe the faces of the sailors. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show distinctive helmets and shields for each group, but the carvers may have exaggerated or simplified. The Peliset are often linked to the Philistines, who left their own pottery and burial customs in Canaan. The Sherden appear earlier in Egyptian records as mercenaries before vanishing into the chaos of the collapse. Each identification raises as many questions as it answers. The very label Sea Peoples is a modern invention, a convenient term for forces that may have had little in common with one another beyond the destruction they caused. The speed of the collapse compounds the mystery. At site after site, the evidence points to a period of just a few decades, maybe only a single generation, for the entire eastern Mediterranean to fall. This compressed timeline defies easy explanation. A drought that lasted decades would have been a slow strangulation, not a quick blow. An earthquake storm could have leveled cities within weeks, but it would not have erased all trade at once. The Sea Peoples could have raided the coasts, but they could not have been everywhere simultaneously. The most likely scenario, and the one that frustrates any simple narrative, is that all these forces converged and fed on one another. The drought weakened the empires, the earthquakes shattered their infrastructure, and the Sea Peoples delivered the final death blows. But the exact sequence remains hidden, a chain of events that scholars can only reconstruct through fragments of pottery and the silence of abandoned archives. The fate of the Indus Valley trade adds another layer to the enigma. Long before the Mediterranean collapse, the great cities of the Indus, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dolavera, were already in decline. Their writing system, still undeciphered, offers no record of their last years. Trade with Mesopotamia had ceased around 1900 BCE, centuries before the events that shattered the Mediterranean. What caused that earlier collapse? Climate change again appears to be a factor. A shift in the monsoon patterns that dried up the rivers sustaining those urban centers. The people of the Indus did not vanish. They dispersed into smaller communities, carrying their traditions with them, but they left no direct heirs to their maritime network. They simply faded like a river that changes course and leaves the old channel dry. This means that by the time the Mediterranean crisis erupted, one side of the old trade route had already been broken for generations. The network that fell around 1200 BC was already missing a vital limb. New excavations continue to challenge and refine these narratives. At Tel Tzaf in Israel, archaeologists have uncovered a settlement dating to the late 6th millennium BC, far older than the Bronze Age collapse. But the site is revealing something remarkable about the transition. The layers show continuous occupation through the very period when the great empires fell. The people of Tel Tzaf did not flee, they did not burn, they kept on farming, kept on burying their dead, kept on making pottery. The destruction was not universal. It was targeted at the palaces, the ports, the centers of power. In the villages and farmsteads, life went on, quieter, poorer, but persistent. This discovery reshapes the picture of the collapse. It was not a complete erasure of human life. It was a collapse of systems, not of people. The trade routes died, the kings lost their thrones, the scribes put down their styluses, but the families in the countryside survived. They adapted, they stored their grain differently, forged their tools from local iron, and stopped looking to the horizon for ships that would never come. Tel Tzaf and sites like it are rewriting the story, showing that the Dark Age was not so much a time of barbarism as a time of reorientation. The cities shrank, but knowledge did not vanish. It went underground, preserved in the hands of potters, farmers, and grandmothers who remembered how to weave. The greatest mystery may not be what destroyed the Bronze Age world, but how the people who lived through it managed to hold on to enough to start again. The Sea Peoples will never be fully known. The exact year the last shipment of tin left the port of Byblos may never be found. The Indus script will likely remain silent. But each new trench dug in the earth reveals another piece of the puzzle. The work of excavation is slow, patient, and often uncertain. It is the opposite of the sudden collapse it seeks to understand. And that slow work, the careful brushing away of dust from a clay tablet, the sieving of soil for a bead of Baltic amber, the reading of tree rings from a timber that fell 3,000 years ago, that is how the silence finally begins to speak. The questions will outlast the answers, but that is exactly what keeps the search alive. The great trade routes of the Bronze Age left behind ruins, but also a blueprint for what came next. The perfect storm of drought, earthquake, and invasion that shattered the old order did not erase the human drive to connect. It only redirected it. The lessons carved into the ash layers of Hattusa and Ugarit are not warnings meant to be forgotten. They are patterns that repeat across centuries, reminding us that every system carries the seeds of its own transformation. When the palaces fell, the knowledge of iron smelting spread from village to village, turning local ore into tools that no longer required distant shipments. The Phoenician ships carved new pathways along coasts the old empires never reached. Greek colonies scattered seeds of trade across the Black Sea and the western Mediterranean. The Assyrian roads bound the Near East under a single imperial hand, while caravans of camel and horse began stitching together the vast spaces between China and the Mediterranean. Each of these new networks borrowed something from the old, but none of them were simply a copy. They were responses to a world that had learned the hard way that concentration was fragile and that resilience demanded diversity. The Bronze Age trade routes did not vanish because people stopped wanting copper or tin or lapis lazuli. They vanished because the system that delivered them could not bend. What replaced them was not a single system but a patchwork of smaller, more adaptable ones, each shaped by the specific pressures of its time and place. The story of that collapse and recovery is not sealed in the past. It echoes in the way we build our own connections today, in the goods we move, the routes we rely on, and the fragility we sometimes overlook. If the ruins of the Bronze Age have one final message, it is that the horizon always shifts. What falls away makes room for what rises. If this journey through the vanished networks and their replacements has sparked a question or a theory of your own, share it in the comments below. And if you want to follow where history leads next, subscribe to the channel. there are always more silent roads waiting to speak.